Hello everybody. Okay, so this is Dr. Golding, and we're going to get back into our discussion of the chapter from Plato. So maybe just a little bit of review from last time what we did, hit some of the main points. We saw last time mainly an argument by this fellow named Glaucon, and Glaucon actually was Plato's brother in real life. Anyway, Glaucon presents an argument which we called the argument of the ring, and the idea there was that if you imagine this ring that could make you invisible, then Glaucon claims that anyone who had such a ring would do pretty much what Gyges, that's the mythical figure who actually supposedly had this ring that made him invisible. Glaucon claims that anybody would do what Gyges did with the ring. That is to say that they would go ahead and do all sorts of unjust actions, including theft, murder, and so on, because as long as they can get away with it, so to speak, as long as there are no consequences for their behavior, they're going to do whatever they want to do. And his claim is that therefore no one in the real world where we don't have such a ring, okay, the only reason people are behaving justly is because of the consequences of injustice or because of the consequences of behaving justly. We don't want to get caught. We don't want to go to jail. We don't want to get punished. We don't want to get censured in some way or maybe even become embarrassed because of our actions. So therefore we behave justly, not because we want to be just for its own sake, but rather because of our desire to avoid certain negative consequences. And essentially, as I mentioned last time, Glaucon is presenting a challenge to Socrates. He wants Socrates to show us, the reader, me and you and him, Socrates should show us, this is what Glaucon wants, Socrates should show us why we should want to be just because justice is somehow a good thing for us. Okay? And we also talked a little bit about the term I introduced, psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is the view that people are by nature selfish, that the only reason or motivation for why anybody does anything is because they're going to get some benefit out of it. Now, we did not really define what is self-interest. What does it mean to benefit yourself? Okay, that was sort of left undefined, and maybe we'll get back to that issue at some point soon. But in any case, psychological egoism is the view that people are by nature only going to do things that are ultimately self-serving. That seems to be at least one of the underlying assumptions about human nature that Glaucon is making. And we'll have to see whether in some way Socrates actually agrees with that or disagrees with that or what. But the main thing we did last time was the ring argument. Okay, so the next little selection in your book is also from Plato's Republic. But it involves a man by the name of Thrasymachus. So I'm going to write that name down on the board. It is, of course, in the reading. But we talked about Glaucon last time. Now we're going to talk about this fellow named Thrasymachus. And apparently Thrasymachus was also a real person that Socrates actually knew and conversed with in real life. But in any event, what's important for us is to try to understand what is Thrasymachus' view. Okay? So Thrasymachus expresses the view that, as he says sometimes, justice is the interest of the stronger. Okay? I'll write that down on the board. Justice is the interest or benefit of the stronger, meaning the one one who is stronger or the people who are stronger. Okay? In other words, what Thrasymachus is saying is something like this, that in a society, there are going to be certain rules or regulations about what is considered just or unjust. So, for example, in most societies, theft is unjust, right? Murder is considered unjust. It's something that you're not supposed to do. Now, actually, what Thrasymachus thinks is that basically the rules of justice, or justice itself, is essentially a creation. It's an invention made up, concocted by people who are in power to keep those who are not in power exactly where they are, namely without much power themselves. Okay, so to put it in simple terms, in any society, in most societies, you will have people who are rich, wealthy, and powerful, and then you have people who are not so powerful. They're poor, they don't have so much, they're not very powerful. Okay, so what Thrasymachus is saying is that justice is invented. It's a sort of a fiction. There really is no such thing as this sort of rule about how you're supposed to behave. Essentially, Thrasymachus thinks that people are by nature selfish. He also agrees with Glaucon, or seems to agree with psychological egoism, and he's claiming that people are by nature looking out for themselves. Now, those who are wealthy and those who are in power always want to keep those who are not in power, those who are weak, exactly where they are, powerless. So the strong, the governments, the king, the tyrant, whoever is running the country, has these rules that they have made up, and they tell people, don't steal, don't cheat, be nice to your neighbor, and so on. When really the reason that the powerful have created this institution of justice is to maintain their own power and their own wealth. Okay? Now, in addition to believing or arguing, claiming that justice is the interest of the stronger, Thrasymachus makes another claim, which is for our purposes just as important. And he actually claims that, remember we had this list of virtues we talked about? The virtues include wisdom and courage and temperance and piety. And justice was one of the 5 classic Greek virtues. So Thrasymachus comes along and claims that injustice is a virtue. Okay, this is meant to be something shocking, and indeed it is. He claims that injustice is a virtue. You're better off being unjust than you are being just. Of course, what he means is as long as you can get away with it. Okay? Remember, a virtue is a good quality. A virtue is a quality that you should have. A virtue is supposed to be something that is a positive, good thing to have. So, Thrasymachus claims that injustice is a virtue. It's better to be unjust than just. Now, why? Because, of course, Thrasymachus thinks that really deep down by nature, every human being wants to benefit himself or herself or themselves. And so, if you could be unjust as much as possible and get away with it, then indeed you will be better off, and therefore he regards injustice as a virtue. Now, you might say this is a very cynical view about justice or injustice, and I think I would kind of agree with that, but let's look a little bit at what is Thrasymachus' argument. What is Thrasymachus' argument here? So first of all, there's really, I think, 2 parts to his argument. One is a sort of look around at the world and see what's going on. Thrasymachus claims that if you look around the world, look around your own society, he claims you will find, as the famous saying goes, nice guys finish last. I'm sure you've heard this phrase. I'm going to write that down on the board. I don't think you'll find this word for word in the reading, but basically the old saying goes, nice guys finish last. Okay, what does that mean? This is again something that Thrasymachus would assert and affirm. Nice guys finish last. Basically, Thrasymachus is saying that if you're a nice person, if you're a so-called a just person, you don't steal and you don't cheat, and if someone loses an object, you try to return it to them, and you always pay back your loans, stuff like that, okay? You never cheat, never steal, you're always honest. You're taking a test, for example, and you don't cheat, even though, let's suppose, unless you cheat, you're going to fail the course, let's suppose, okay? Or you have an opportunity to, let's say, steal $1 million, and if you're a nice guy, you say, nope, I'm not going to steal the $1 million. Well, what happens over the long run? Thrasymachus claims that nice guys, people who are just, end up with less. Okay? They always end up with less. They end up on the bottom of the heap of society. Thrasymachus is a very kind of cold-blooded, very dry-eyed look, has a very dry-eyed look at human beings. Human beings, so I said there were two aspects to his arguments. Let me make that clear. Argument number one is you look around, you see, based on just looking around, seeing the evidence from society, that people who get to the top of society, meaning people who have a lot of wealth and power, basically you have to claw your way to the top, and you have to step on other people to get to the top. So as it turns out, as a matter of fact, those people who are unjust turn out to be better off. They have more wealth, they have more power, and they enjoy life more, according to Thrasymachus. Okay, so that's argument number one. Now, argument number two would be, I think, what Thrasymachus is saying is that human beings by nature, human beings are self-interested. We want what is best for ourselves. The best way to get what is for yourself, the best way to benefit yourself, is by behaving unjustly. Now, of course, Thrasymachus would agree that, let's suppose if you were poor and, it doesn't make sense to, let's say, rob someone to get $5. $5, it's not worth it. You might get caught. For $5, you might end up in prison. So Thrasymachus is not saying that anybody everywhere should always do unjust things no matter what. No. He's saying that Thrasymachus would agree with the ring argument, okay? Thrasymachus would agree with the claim that Glaucon made in the ring argument. The only reason people are just is because they're afraid of the consequences, but Thrasymachus is going a step further than Glaucon. He's saying, therefore, when you have the opportunity to be unjust and to get away with it, to steal whatever you think you need or want, to kill off whoever you want, your enemies, to step on other people to get more power, more wealth, then Thrasymachus is saying, go for it. That is a good thing for you to do. Okay, and why are people just? According to Thrasymachus, people are just only because of the consequences. Why do people somehow think that justice is a good thing? Basically, Thrasymachus thinks that, again, like I said before, justice, the idea of justice, is sort of a fictitious virtue. It's not really a virtue, okay? But justice is invented and created over the course of time by people who are in power. to try to get those who don't have power to stay where they are on the bottom totem pole of society. Okay, that is basically Thrasymachus' view. And hopefully when we have our conversation, discussion, meeting group, we can talk about what you think about Thrasymachus' view. I don't necessarily agree with it. It's not my view, and it's not going to be Socrates' view either. It's not going to be Plato's view. So you have to understand that, and if you've studied Plato before, you probably know this, you should know this, that what Plato does is he presents different views, some of which he and Socrates, his mentor, radically disagree with. Okay, so Thrasymachus' view is not going to be Plato's view. Okay, and what we're going to have to see is how Socrates tries to argue, no, that it actually is good to be just, that it is in your interest to be just, that justice is something that you should want to do for its own sake. Okay? One of the things we might reflect on, though, before moving on to the next section in the book, is, this is a question to think about, is what conception of the good life does Thrasymachus have? How is Thrasymachus thinking of what it means to live a good life? Okay? And in what way does that conception of the good life underlie his view that injustice is a virtue, that justice is really the interest of the stronger, that nice guys always finish last, which to some degree does seem to be true, at least in certain societies. Okay? So, but again, the question I'm asking you to think about is, what conception of the good life, what counts, that's really one of the fundamental questions we have to think about, is what makes a good life truly good? And let me just throw out a term here that sometimes is used to describe a certain way of looking at a good life. And this term can have multiple meanings, but okay, I'm just going to erase this for the sake of room. And here we're going to put down this term. The term is materialism. Okay, so materialism. Materialism is the view that what makes a good life good is basically having material wealth and power. Okay, material wealth. I'm talking about money, possessions, and material power. The ability to do whatever you really want to do. Material power. Okay? So it looks like this is at least underlying Thrasymachus' view. A good life is one where you have a lot of wealth and a lot of possessions, a lot of money, and you're able to do whatever you want to do. You're able to dominate others, control others, rather than be controlled by others. Okay, so maybe one way in which we might either, let's say, disagree with Thrasymachus or perhaps even challenge his argument is to say that perhaps we don't agree that this is necessarily the best form of life, that this is a good life. So then the question would be, if materialism is wrong, what would the, question mark, what would be the alternative, or what might be some alternatives to materialism? What I'm saying is that if Thrasymachus is correct, that materialism is the correct view about the good life, Okay, materialism is the view that a good life consists in these things. Then it would seem that it would follow that everything else that he said is correct. Perhaps, right? That if this is what makes a good life good, then human beings are going to be motivated to only behave justly when they kind of have to, right? That's what kind of the whole argument here, Glaucon's argument, going back to that for a minute, is that it seems like justice, at least to Glaucon and to Thrasymachus, justice is a compromise that we make. We don't really want to be just. We want to do whatever the hell we want to do, essentially. We want to have money, we want to have power, we want to have wealth, we want to promote our own self-interest, and unfortunately, we kind of have to be just, because if we are unjust, we might get caught, thrown in prison. Who's doing that? It's the people who are in power, of course, who are going to throw us in prison, or someone else who's more powerful than us is going to punish us. So in any event, I think that materialism is definitely playing a role here in underlying Thrasymachus' view about why he thinks that injustice is actually better than justice. Okay, so we're going to leave Thrasymachus behind for now and move on, and we're going to have to come back later, and probably next time, not this time, but next time, we'll see how Socrates is going to propose a theory of justice in which it turns out that we should want to be just, and that justice is a virtue, okay? But for now, we're going to go on to talk about the next little selection in your reading is actually not from the Republic. It's from another dialogue written by Plato, which is called the Gorgias. You don't have to take that down, because it's not so important right now to remember the specific name of the dialogue from which that section is taken. Well, I'll write it on the board anyway. Gorgias. Okay, Gorgias was a person who lived during the time of Socrates, and he had certain views about justice and virtue. But what's more important is that in the dialogue that takes place within the work called the Gorgias, Socrates encounters a fellow by the name of Callicles. Okay, so this is the important name for us today, Callicles. Now, Callicles believes in something which we're going to call ethical hedonism. All right, ethical hedonism. What is ethical hedonism? Ethical hedonism is the view that pleasure is the good. Pleasure is the good, and consequently, or these kind of go hand in hand, you want to know what's good, pleasure is good. Conversely, pain is the bad. Okay? This is known as ethical hedonism. The reason why it's called ethical hedonism is because, well, the word in Greek for pleasure is hedone. Hedone equals pleasure. Okay, so that's just what the word hedone means in Greek. So ethical hedonism is the name of this view that the good, that which is good, that which is worth pursuing, is pleasure, and that which is bad is pain. Okay, so you might say this is, in a way, a view about what the good life is that I think is actually, in a way, pretty popular, and it might be, some of you might think that this is true to some extent, or maybe completely. We all know that pleasure is something we enjoy, right? Without even trying to define what pleasure is, let's say just this, that pleasure is some kind of a sensation or experience which feels good, okay? Without trying to explain it or define it, when you have pleasure, it generally feels good to you, right? And pain is something that feels bad, okay? If I'm trying to give you basically a little bit of how Callicles would support the idea that pleasure is the good and pain is the bad. If I ask you how you're doing today, how are you? And you say, I'm not so good, I'm not so good today. I might say, why? What's wrong? What's hurting you, right? Pain is something that human beings wish to avoid, and pleasure is something that we pursue. So it's natural for us to think that that's what is good. Pleasure is the good and pain is the bad. Another way of putting this claim, ethical hedonism, is to say that this is a view about what makes for a good life. What would make your life good as opposed to bad overall is the more pleasure you have. A life of pleasure is a good life, and a life of pain is going to be a bad life. Okay, so this is what Callicles believes. Pleasure is the good, pain is the bad. And I'm going to introduce another term here, which is sort of similar to something we talked about earlier. So I hope you got this down. Let's talk about another view that somebody might have. We're going to call this psychological hedonism. Okay, now you won't find this phrase in your text. Okay, this is a modern term. Modern contemporary philosophers use this term to describe a certain view. Psychological hedonism, it's sort of similar to psychological egoism, and in a way they're kind of related. But psychological hedonism says, I'll write it on the board, every voluntary action or every voluntary human action is motivated by a desire for pleasure. Every voluntary human action is motivated by a desire for pleasure, and by that I mean, well, let me just add here, for pleasure that is the pleasure of the person doing the action, the pleasure of the agents, okay, the pleasure of the agent, that is to say, the person doing the action. Basically, psychological hedonism says that human beings by nature are pleasure seekers, and that everything we do for the sake of achieving some kind of pleasure, or it could be also to avoid some kind of pain. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we don't sometimes do things that give other people pleasure as well, okay? So, for example, if I cook a meal for somebody, according to psychological hedonism, I'm only going to do it if I get some pleasure out of cooking the meal. But it could also happen that somebody else gets pleasure from the meal that I have cooked for them. But I'm only going to do it if it gives me pleasure to do it. So the fact that it causes somebody else pleasure is still consistent with psychological hedonism. Okay, now in a way, you could look at psychological hedonism as a form of psychological egoism. Okay, because remember, if you look back in your notes regarding psychological egoism says everybody's motivated by a desire for self-interest. And here what we're saying is everyone is motivated by a desire for pleasure. So anyone who believes in psychological hedonism is someone who believes in psychological egoism as well. Everything you do for the sake of some pleasure that you're going to get. Basically, the psychological hedonist says self-interest. What is self-interest? It's pleasure. People act for the sake of self-interest, and the psychological hedonist says what that amounts to is acting for the sake of one's pleasure or to avoid pain. So this is the view that probably Callicles also has. Okay, so the difference between, before we had on the board ethical hedonism, okay, ethical hedonism is the view that what's good is pleasure and what's bad is pain. Psychological hedonism is a view about motivation. So it's possible some people who are psychological hedonists are also naturally going to be ethical hedonists. It might be possible to be an ethical hedonist without being a psychological hedonist. Maybe you could think that we're not hardwired to pursue only our own pleasure, but that ultimately is what's good. Okay, but most ethical hedonists probably also believe that this is true, or to a large extent true as well. Okay, now what you should be thinking about here is, if we go back to ethical hedonism, pleasure is the good, right? Pleasure is the good. Okay. One possible, we're going to see how Socrates argues against ethical hedonism in a few minutes, okay? But before we get to that, I wanted to throw out a possible objection against ethical hedonism. If you say pleasure is the good, aren't there some things that are pleasurable, but they're also bad? Okay? So here's a potential criticism against ethical hedonism. You're saying pleasure is the good, but I'm going to give you an example, or at least an apparent example, of something that is bad, but it's also pleasurable. Okay, like for example, let's talk about smoking cigarettes. Okay, smoking cigarettes. Now, for some people, don't like smoking cigarettes at all. It's painful for them, so they would agree that smoking is bad. But some people enjoy smoking cigarettes. Okay, or smoking cigarettes. Or doing hard drugs, let's say. Okay, certain kinds of very hard drugs, I guess I'm thinking of heroin, can be very intoxicatingly pleasurable. But don't we all agree that that's bad? So how can you say that pleasure is the good? We have cases of things that are pleasurable, but they're also bad. Doesn't that show that this has got to be wrong? Okay, so that's a potential criticism against ethical hedonism. Now, how might the ethical hedonist, again, Callicles is someone who believes in ethical hedonism, how might the ethical hedonist respond to those examples? Okay, well, you can think about that. But I'll tell you what I think he might say. He might say something like this. Look, the reason why these things are bad is because in the long run, they are going to cause more pain than pleasure, right? If you smoke cigarettes, the reason why we say smoking cigarettes is bad is not because there's something wrong about the pleasure of smoking. If you get pleasure from smoking cigarettes, the pleasure is good. The problem with smoking cigarettes is that in the long run, if you keep smoking cigarettes and you get addicted or you smoke a lot, or depending upon how much you smoke, even if you don't smoke a lot, depending upon your biology, you could get sick. You could get lung cancer, you could get lung disease, and eventually that is going to be painful, right? You may die a painful death because you smoked cigarettes too much, okay? So that's why it's bad. The bad thing about smoking cigarettes is precisely because it leads to a massive or potentially a massive amount of pain in the long run. The same thing with doing hard drugs, doing heroin. The pleasure, according to the hedonists, okay, according to someone like Callicles, the pleasure that you get from doing hard drugs, if you do get some kind of pleasure, that's great, that's wonderful. The problem is that eventually you could get addicted, you can get to the point where you need more and more heroin to get that high, and then eventually it causes health problems, and then you're in a serious state of discomfort and pain, and that is precisely why doing hard drugs is bad. Okay, so the lesson here is that some things are surely pleasurable in the short run, but they're not pleasurable in the long run. In the long run, they are painful, and therefore they are bad. Okay, so we might then, in saying that pleasure is the good, or in talking about ethical hedonism, we could consider different forms or different variations on ethical hedonism. Okay, so there's short term, I'm going to call this short term EH. EH stands for ethical hedonism. And we can call the opposite or the other view long term EH. And sometimes this is called enlightened ethical hedonism. Okay? Enlightened ethical hedonism or long-term ethical hedonism says pleasure is the good, but what's really good is overall long-term pleasure throughout the course of your life. That's what you should pursue. That's what is good according to ethical hedonism, according to long-term or enlightened. The concept of, or the term enlightened connotes that you don't just look at the short term, you look at the long term. Okay? Short-term ethical hedonism is the view that what's good is to pursue pleasure of the moment. Okay? If you see a pleasure, especially if it's a really good, pleasurable pleasure, right? According to short-term hedonism, go for the immediate satisfaction of that particular pleasure. Long-term ethical hedonism says, wait a second, if you're really interested in pleasure, it makes more sense to be judicious, to be smart and clever about your pursuit of pleasure. Both of these views think that pleasure is the good. Long-term ethical hedonism seems to me, and I think Callicles would agree with, long-term ethical hedonism, not the short-term ethical hedonism. Because if you go for the short-term pleasure, meaning by that the immediate satisfaction, immediate gratification, then that's by and large going to bring about a lot of pain, right, and suffering. And if you go for it, it makes more sense that if you're really interested in pleasure in the first place, that you should try to maximize your pleasure over the course of your lifetime rather than going for the short-term pleasure when that can lead to pain in the long run. Okay, so the long-term or enlightened hedonist would say things like, for example, don't smoke, or at least don't smoke very much. Don't use hard drugs, because in the long run that's going to cause you pain. There's lots of things you do in life that are painful in the short term, but they're still good to do. They're still good to do because ultimately they lead to more pleasure in the long run. So for example, going to the dentist, doing your exercise regimen that may be painful in the short term, overall you're going to have a healthier body and you're going to be able to enjoy life more. Maybe when it comes to studying or going to school, sometimes taking classes, doing homework, studying may be difficult and painful, but if you get that degree and then you're able to make more money and then you're able to buy more goods and you're able to enjoy life and get more pleasure out of life, well then it turns out that it's a good thing to do because it leads to more pleasure in the long run. Okay, so most ethical hedonists who, are around, people like Callicles, of course he's not around anymore because he was an ancient person, but most ethical hedonists would endorse long-term ethical hedonism, because if you really believe that pleasure is the good, then you're going to try to maximize your pleasure overall. Now, so that's, we talked about a criticism against ethical hedonism based on the cases of smoking and hard drugs. Another way of trying to criticize ethical hedonism is to say something like, well, aren't there certain actions that would give me pleasure, but they're immoral? Okay? So for example, it might give me pleasure if I could, let's say, steal my neighbor's television. Let's say my neighbor has this really nice high definition television and I have some, barely, stinky old black and white TV from the 1970s or 60s. And I really want that high definition TV that my neighbor has. And so it's going to give me, let's suppose I think about trying to, somehow steal the TV. Isn't that immoral? Isn't it wrong? Isn't it bad to steal? Okay, so here the ethical hedonist might say, there's a couple of different ways we could go with this. The ethical hedonist might say, look, if you steal the TV, you might get caught. And then you're going to be punished by the law, or your neighbor might be angry at you and take revenge and steal something back from you. So while it's true that you would get some pleasure if you stole the TV and you could get away with it, it's still wrong because overall the chances are that you're going to suffer pain in some way by stealing the TV. So that really is what makes it wrong. What makes it wrong is not the fact that it's going to give you pleasure to steal the TV. Again, it's kind of in the short term. You're going to steal the TV and watch it for a little while, but if you get caught, and there is always some chance that you're going to get caught, so therefore what makes stealing the TV wrong, according to the ethical hedonism view, is that it's going potentially to cause you more pain than it is going to cause you pleasure. Okay, well you can think about whether that's a good response. What we need to do now is talk about what's in the selection, the reading that you have, where Socrates tries to show that ethical hedonism is mistaken. Not for any of the reasons that I've tried to give or discuss, but Socrates comes up with a very, I'll say, curious and interesting and somewhat maybe puzzling argument. Socrates is going to try to refute or give a refutation of the claim that pleasure is the good. Okay, so I'm going to erase this because Socrates' argument has several steps, and we're going to call this Socrates, that's Socrates, I know that says socks, but Socrates' refutation. Okay, a refutation, I'm sure you know, is a kind of argument where you try to show that some other view is wrong or false. Socrates' refutation of, I'm just going to say EH, and you'll remember EH stands for ethical hedonism, and that's the view that pleasure is the good. That's what the good is. The good is identical with pleasure. Okay, so I'm expecting that you read through the reading, and I'm just going to sort of put on the board in a series of steps how Socrates tries to show Callicles that this cannot possibly be correct. Okay, so there's going to be some steps that are right on the board, and here we go. So here's step one. Step one says, in each of these cases, for each of these steps, Socrates gets Callicles to admit that something is correct, and then eventually leads him down this path that shows that ethical hedonism is false. So the first step, the first thing that Socrates gets Callicles to agree with is that good and bad, and we sometimes use the word evil for bad. I'm using evil and bad interchangeably, at least for today. I'll just say bad. Good and bad are opposites. Right? Doesn't that seem to be true? Good and bad are opposites. It's like tall and short, high and low, large and small. Good is the opposite of bad. Callicles agrees that this is true. Okay? Now, the next step is a claim about all opposites. Alright, so I'm going to write this on the board and then give some examples. It's a little complicated, so bear with me here. Given a pair of opposites, given any pair of opposites, given a pair of opposites, comma, they cannot be present at the same time they cannot be present at the same time, at the same place, and in the same respect. Okay, I noticed that my marker is beginning to fail a little bit. I apologize for that, but I'll make sure next time to get a new marker. But let me just read this through in case you can't see it. Given a pair of opposites, they cannot be present at the same time, at the same place, and in the same respect. Okay, for example, let's take healthy and sick. Those are opposites, right? Healthy is the opposite of sick. Well, you can't be both healthy and sick at the same time, at the same place, and in the same respect. Okay, so for example, you could have a healthy set of eyes and a diseased set of, let's say, lungs, or vice versa, right? You could have a really unhealthy leg, but very healthy ears. Okay, so you as a human being can be both sick in one way and healthy in another way. That's possible. But at the same time, at the same place, in the same respect, or in the same thing, you can't both be healthy and sick at the same time simultaneously, right? Okay, it's like, for example, let's take tall and short. The way opposites work is you can't be both tall and short at the same time. Now, we have to add in the same respect. So, for example, with tall and short, you might be tall with respect to one person. Let's say you're taller than some small baby, but you're short with respect to someone who is, let's say, a 7-foot, basketball player or whatever, right? So you could be tall with respect to some people and short with respect to others. But with respect to the same person, you can't be both tall and short at the same time in the same respect, right? Okay, at the same time, that's important too, because you might be taller than one person at one time, and then later on you're shorter than that person because maybe that person grew. But at the same time, at the same place, in the same respect, you cannot have two opposites coexisting, because that is exactly what an opposite or a pair of opposites is like. That's the definition of opposites, that they cannot exist at the same time, same place, otherwise they wouldn't be opposites. Okay, so this step number 2 is really a claim about opposites. Now let's move on to, and again I'm summarizing, paraphrasing, putting in a sort of structured way what is in the reading with regard to Socrates' conversation with Callicles, again, in which he's trying to refute ethical hedonism. So we've got steps 1 and 2. Now here comes step 3. Now step 3, I'm going to write this on the board and then we'll talk about it. Step 3, Socrates claims and Callicles admits that pleasure and pain sometimes, not all the time, but I'll say sometimes occur, and to make it short and sweet, I'll just say occur simultaneously. Simultaneously. Okay, exclamation mark. Pleasure and pain sometimes occur simultaneously. Now the word simultaneously simply means at the same time, the same place, and in the same respect. Okay, how does this happen? When does this happen? So Socrates is kind of asking us to imagine the following situation. Let's take thirst and quenching of one's thirst. Okay, as an example of a pain and a pleasure. When you could use hunger and eating, or the gratification that you get from eating as examples. Let's suppose you're very, very thirsty. You're like dying of thirst. So there's a certain kind of pain involved in that. Or if you're very hungry, you're in pain because you're hungry. So you're experiencing this pain of hunger or thirst. And now let's suppose you finally get to a place where you can slake your thirst. You get to a delicious water fountain, okay? Or you get to this delicious stream. You're in the desert and you're like dying of thirst and you're in pain, and you finally get to this stream of water and you just start drinking this cold, refreshing, delicious water. And so now you are getting pleasure. Now, in the first few moments of when you are, or this might last for a while if you're extremely thirsty, in those moments when you are both thirsty, and you're starting to quench your thirst, what's happening? Socrates says you are experiencing pain and pleasure at the same time, at the same place, and in the same respect. Your you're still, now once you, the interesting thing, Socrates kind of points this out too, is that when you drink a lot and eventually you slake your thirst, what happens is you stop drinking. Or even if you continue drinking, you no longer get so much pleasure anymore from the drinking. The thing about the pleasure of quenching your thirst or satisfying your hunger is that the pain and the pleasure occur simultaneously. They occur at the same moment, or at the same, there's several moments when they're occurring. You're getting the pleasure of the drinking while you're having the thirst and the hunger, or the hunger for the food or the drink. Okay, I keep flipping from hunger to thirst, but the example is the same. So we see that with pleasure and pain, there's something very strange. They can occur simultaneously, as in the example that I gave. Now, he's not saying that pleasure and pain always occur simultaneously. Okay, so for example, he would admit that, let's suppose you're walking in the forest, you're just walking along, all of a sudden a bee stings you and you start feeling pain. Ow, 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 ow. Okay, so there you're just, you might have pleasure because you're walking, but the bee is stinging you, or the bee just stung you, so you have pain from the bee sting. So there, the pain is by itself. There's no pleasure involved in the bee sting. Okay? Or it might be that, you are, you're sitting in a room somewhere and your favorite other, your spouse, or your partner comes over and just starts rubbing your back and gives you a massage, and you start feeling pleasure. Okay, so there you just start feeling pleasure. There was no pain involved at all. So again, Socrates is not claiming that every time you have pleasure, there must be a pain involved, or that every time you have pain, there's going to be a pleasure involved. That's not true. But what he's saying is that sometimes it does happen. It can happen. And it does happen. As in the example that we gave, the person coming in from, let's say, playing basketball outside in the heat, or the person who's traveling through the desert, and they're very thirsty, and they're in pain, and then they start drinking that cold, refreshing water. And right at that moment, or those several moments when they begin the drinking process, they are experiencing the pain of the thirst and the pleasure of slaking their thirst at the same time. And again, Socrates emphasizes that very often the pleasure drops down or almost goes away completely when the thirst is slaked. So pleasure and pain sometimes kind of have this mutual relationship, that the more you really are in pain, or the more you have that thirst for the water, the more pleasurable it is. And when that pain or thirst drops off, that's exactly when the pleasure of the drinking drops off. Okay? Sometimes the greatest pleasure of eating is when you're hungry. If you're not so hungry, you don't really get so much pleasure from eating, right? So we see that pleasure and pain are kind of interconnected in some interesting way here. Okay, that is step number 3. Pleasure and pain sometimes occur simultaneously. And now we are ready for the conclusion. Well, let's just say here, we'll make this not the conclusion yet, but here's step 4. Step 4 is we can now, based on 1, 2, and 3, or let's say based on steps 2 and 3, I can infer that pleasure and pain are not opposites, are not opposites. Okay, again, I apologize for my weak marker. I will get another marker for next time. But if they can occur simultaneously, which they do, then they can't be opposites. Because if they were opposites, this couldn't happen. So 4, we can put these little 3 dots here. Sometimes we do this in philosophy and geometry. This indicates that this step is something that follows from previous steps. In this case, it follows from steps 2 and 3. Pleasure and pain are not opposites. But now we can reach the final conclusion. Here is step 5, and sometimes we draw a line to indicate that this is the end of an argument. This argument is made up of these steps that now lead to this conclusion. Step 5, the conclusion is that pleasure, I'll write it like this: pleasure does not equal good, and pain does not equal bad. Okay, a little bit informal here. I hope you can see that. I hope you get the point. We said that good and bad are opposites. Remember, that was step number 1. Good and bad are opposites, but now we see that pleasure and pain are not opposites. So that means that pleasure, whatever pleasure is, it's not the same thing as the good, and whatever pain is, it's not the same thing as the bad. This doesn't mean, Socrates might agree that, well, there's some interesting relationship between good and pleasure. There's some interesting relationship between the bad and pain, but whatever they are, they're not identical. Okay? So, this is the refutation that Socrates gives of EH, because EH, ethical hedonism, asserts that good is identical with pleasure, pain is identical with bad. Well, what we've tried to show in this argument is that that cannot possibly be correct. Good and bad are opposites, pleasure and pain are not opposites, therefore ethical hedonism has been refuted. Now in the text, Callicles has nothing to say to try to get out of the refutation. He doesn't have any response. He still presumably goes on believing that his view is correct. He doesn't really change his mind, but he can't find a way out of Socrates' apparent refutation. So what I would like you to do is to think about whether you agree that this is a good argument against ethical hedonism. So to do that, you would think about, are the premises true? Does the argument flow logically? Is this a good refutation of ethical hedonism? If you believed in ethical hedonism, if you believed, or maybe you do, that pleasure is the good, and that is the true good in life, how would you try to answer Socrates' refutation? And that's something that we can talk about more when we have our discussion, conversation coming up, whenever it's scheduled to come up on. So I've gone on for about an hour, and so we got through the section on Thrasymachus, we got through the section on Callicles, and I'm going to close it up here for this lecture, and next lecture we'll continue and get more into, really get into for the first time, how Socrates tries to sort of lay down a theory of what virtue is that does not agree with hedonism, does not agree with materialism, and will try to show us that we do have a good motive for behaving justly, and it's not just about avoiding negative consequences of getting caught and things like that. Okay, so all the best wishes to you, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Thank you.